He awoke into the pitch blackness, into a quiet night. His thoughts were still dreamlike, and he would have gone straight back to sleep without even remembering that he'd woken if it hadn't been for an odd sensation that brought him further into consciousness. He could feel someone tapping against his leg. His first thought was that it was his pulse throbbing regularly against through a vein that he could temporarily sense. Then it felt like fingers, and half dreaming, he smiled with the thought of Lizzie touching his thigh as they slept. Whenever he got into bed before her, she would always do things like this, press a cold hand to his chest or cold feet to his, wanting him to warm her. He'd flinch away laughing, and she would say that he wasn't a tactile person. He sat bolt upright and fumbled for the bedside lamp. Even before he had turned it on, the tapping sensation had stopped. He blinked in the sudden light, looking around the room, feeling just how empty it was without her. The only movement was his blurred reflection casting about in confusion in the bedroom mirror. His heart rate sagged back to its earlier speed. He tried to remember, had it really felt like touch? Really? He could picture Lizzie's hand, pale and slim, and how she used to touch him for reassurance. But most likely it had been merely a dreaming reaction to the rhythms of his own body. You're not a tactile person, you're more visual, he thought carefully, as if the remembered words might bring pain, but there were none to be had. Whatever dream had lingered here tonight couldn't hurt him. It would be best not to think about it.
Trying to Be So Quiet and Other Stories presents 3 stories about love, loss, and the horror that comes when grief removes our reason for living from the world. A husband struggles with the reality of his wife's death as he remembers their life together. Although haunted, he struggles to find the ghosts that assail him as meaningful as the bleak fact that he is now alone. But that doesn't stop him seeing them. A son, coping with the sudden death of his parents, returns to his childhood home, only to find that, despite everything being familiar, things inside seem increasingly unreal. A grieving lover loses all sensation of pain as she tries to make sense of her enduring grief. Trying to Be So Quiet and Other Hauntings was written by James Everington and published by the Sinister Horror Company in 2019. In this episode of Sinister Reread, Justin Park chats with James about one of the publisher's more emotional collections. Hello, this is Justin from the Sinister Horror Company, and I'm here today with James Everington to talk about his book, Trying to Be So Quiet and Other Hauntings. James, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing at the moment?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Are you?
Yeah, very good. James, thanks for agreeing to join us on the podcast today to talk about your book. A book which comprises of one novelette, I guess, with the length, or novella. I'm not quite sure the difference between the two. But one longer story and then 2 other short stories on the end of it as well, which is the Other Hauntings part of it. So that's the format of the book. So, James, if you could begin, the question I always like to ask anyone when I first talk about a book with them is, why did you write the book?
So, I mean, as you might gather from the subtitle of A Hauntings, it's a collection of ghost stories or ghostly stories, which I think is, as a horror writer, something you have to tackle at some point. And for the title story, I was trying to think of a way in, I guess. There's such a weight of ghost stories going back, hundreds of years, about how you can do it in an original way. And I was thinking about the sort of classic turn of the screw idea, where it's the whole ambiguity around whether the ghost is real or whether it's inside their head, which is often used, I guess, as a way of writing about delusion or mental instability and things. But I wanted to kind of approach that idea, but in a different way, that you almost get to the end, and whether the ghost is real or not almost becomes not important, because it's the important thing in a haunting, in these stories certainly, is the person who's haunted and not the thing who's doing the haunting. And that led into the theme of grief and loss, which seemed to kind of natural dovetail with a haunting of a ghost or just a haunting of a mind. So that's where the sort of inspiration for the key story in the book came. And when I came to put together the other stories for it, for this release, it's one of those things where you think consciously about a specific story and then look back for your other work and think, oh God, I've been writing about that all the time anyway. So that, you know, there was a few stories that naturally fitted together when it came to putting this collection together.
So when you first sat down to write Trying to Be So Quiet, you did that with the aim in mind of, right, I'm going to write a ghost story. Is that right?
Yeah, it was quite conscious in terms of the aim of what the story was going to be about, and almost reacting against that kind of literary tradition. The plot and themes and things were almost came out of that, and trying to find a way into it that wasn't just another story about a sheeted ghost going around a castle or a more modern ghost. It was trying to find a different way of looking at it, really. So yeah, it was very consciously trying to write something in that ghost story subgenre without it being derivative, or without it being like things I'd read before or things I'd written before even.
So I was going to ask then, so where did you get your kind of ideas from this? Or was it more a case of you didn't get inspiration ideas from particular areas, but it was the reverse, where you would think about something and try and do the opposite?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. So it's almost it's a truism to say, I guess, that ghost stories and horror stories are about death as a theme, but they're often about death and dying, but it less so, I think, about maybe grief and loss after the death. So that's why it's very much focused on that central character who is the haunted individual, and it's kind of up in the air whether he's haunted by a real ghost with finger quotes around real, or whether it's just his reaction to that loss. And as I say, the idea, it doesn't matter. It's the haunting is real regardless of whether the ghost is real.
And would you say then, when you went there to go, right, I'm going to tackle a ghost story, why particularly did you decide, right, a ghost story is the theme that I'm going to go with, is the trope I'm going to explore?
I think it's out of all the classic, if you like, tropes or monsters in the horror genre, I think it is that ambiguity element about what it means and whether it's real. There's lots of zombie stories and zombie novels and things, but a zombie to me is it may be a shock if you saw a zombie, but it's a physical threat. And if there was actually a zombie uprising tomorrow, we'd all know what to do. We've all seen the films. We'd all suddenly have ways to behead it and hide ourselves in a room and things, because it's a physical threat, and the threat of a zombie is it will kill you and turn you into another zombie. Whereas a ghost is more ambiguous about what it means and what its threat is to you, and whether it is even a threat or whether it's real, whether it's, there's some stories where it's like a psychic recording in the haunted house, in the building. There's things like Hill House by Shirley Jackson, where it's a reflection of the central characters essentially projected outwards. So I think the ghost story is far more flexible and nuanced as a trope, because it's so much about the characters and who is experiencing the haunting, and that can be different each time. Whereas, I say, a zombie or a vampire, it's the monster itself that's the key thing. It almost doesn't matter as much who's fighting it, and it's a lot more about physical survival. And I'm less, as a writer, interested in that kind of idea around physical combat and survival and things. It's more around the idea, if you see a ghost, it's how would you react? I wouldn't know. Whereas I think I'd know what I'd do if I saw a zombie.
You have your idea, you've got your plan, you want to tackle it with as a ghost story, and you've got your kind of way, or your method. So how do you get your ideas? Where do they come from? And particularly thinking about what when you wrote the stories in this collection, was it a case that you sit down at a computer and the ideas come out, or do they come from other places?
I think it's a mixture, really. I mean, I try and write most of my first drafts just pen and paper, because I find the ideas flow easier that way. I think there's less faffing than if you're trying to save on the computer, or to get an email and it pings up and all that kind of thing.
So and when you say you write them on with pen and paper, do you sit down at a desk and do that, or do you have a book and write it on the go?
Yeah, normally at a desk or a table or whatever. Yeah. And I find the fact that you write the first draft by hand means that when I come to type it up, there's no temptation to think, well, that sentence is good enough, so I'll leave it. You have to physically, type the sentence a second time. So I find it very helpful to force me to reconsider each sentence from that first draft. So I've always done it that way. There's the odd bit of flash fiction, I guess, where I've just done it straight onto the computer. If you're doing 100-word kind of flash fiction, then yeah, I'll probably just skip a few steps. But anything longer, I'm still in that mindset of quickly by hand. I mean, no one can ever read it because my handwriting's atrocious, and even I struggle sometimes if I leave it for a while. So yeah, and it's just that approach of sitting down and letting the ideas come as quickly as they can, and then rewriting from that first draft.
Well, that's interesting. So would you say there's much change between that first draft and that typing up then when you go through? Because you say you're considering every sentence when you go through.
Yeah, I mean sometimes the first draft is quite, I may write 2 pages and then write another 2 pages and decide it's gone wrong somewhere and have to go back, I don't know, the end of the 3rd page and start again almost. The first draft is quite, it sort of goes backwards, you go backwards 1 step to go forward another 2 steps kind of thing. So that takes quite a bit of time. And then the second draft, when I'm typing it up, is any structural changes, and then I'll probably have a few more passes through it just for their sentences and typos and whatnot.
And I was going to sort of ask that. So when you're writing, you say that sometimes you've gone a few pages and gone wrong, so you got to go back. So do you do much planning before you start writing, or is it kind of all in your head and you kind of write and see where it goes? How do you kind of approach it in that way?
I don't tend to do much planning at all, and I kind of it's an odd thing to have the structure in my head, but I almost think of it like I get to the end, and those kind of choose your own adventure books or fighting fantasy books where you've got the different choices, and it's almost like if I go wrong, I go back to a certain point where I think I've made that choice and then make a different choice. So I almost have that kind of idea in my head that obviously I need to write the opening scene to start, and then I can see ideas branching off of that, and I'll take one, and if I feel it's gone wrong, I'll go back to the previous decision point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And start from there. It's something way back when I was studying at university, and one of the lecturers showed us it was how different writers approach their sort of drafts and things. And there was 2 contrasting individuals, and there was D.H. Lawrence, who did almost exactly what I said, and if he went wrong, he had to go back and rewrite everything. And then I think it was Virginia Woolf, who was a lot more, she wrote it and then she'll go back and fiddle with individual sentences. And he was showing that as 2 completely different ways of sort of approaching drafting and things. And I've always been kind of, I'll just charge into it, and then if I go wrong, I need to go back to the last point when I still think it was right, and then I start again. So there's a lot of waste, I guess. But then you get the odd story where I always make the right decisions all the way through and get to the end first time kind of thing. And that feels like really brilliant.
Rare though, I suspect, right?
Yeah.
So without this plan then, where you've just got it in your head, you kind of just sort of start, do you have the ending already in mind and you've got to try and way to get there? And do you have particular scenes that you want to kind of get to and show, or is it all you've only got a start and a theme, and then everything's new as you kind of write?
Yeah, I think it's more the theme. I mean, particularly this story, I didn't have the ending at all, and the original drafts were. It was more a kind of horror ending, you know, a traditional horror kind of. It's a ghost. It needs a scary ending, kind of thing. So I think particularly this story, the actual structure of it and how the haunting progresses it's not building to a crescendo of horror, which is probably what most horror stories do, obviously, and what I was tempted to do. And it was realizing that there's an emotional journey there, but it's not a journey necessarily that's getting darker and darker. It's a journey that's reflecting the different stages of grief. So you know, there's that model of grief around denial, and then I forget it, denial, bargaining, and then etc. And then you get to acceptance at the end, and it not following that rigidly, but it was kind of understanding that the ending of this story needed to be almost getting into that acceptance of loss and death, which was what I wanted this story to be about that sort of grieving process. So yeah, the ending was probably the hardest bit, I think, of this story.
And that's really interesting for me. So you had this, you know, there's this idea of like a haunting, and like any other, like a lot of other stories, they build to this crescendo, as you said. And with this one, it didn't. And by all means, don't worry about talking about spoilers. The whole of this series is spoiler ridden. We can't go in depth without talking about spoilers. So you're more than happy to kind of talk about the ending at this point. Don't worry. But when was it you realised that your ending wasn't going to do that, and it was going to go off in this different direction? Had you written the whole thing, and then at what point did you go, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't what I want to do?
I'm not sure the exact point. I think it was when I look back on what I did, it's that the ghost actually almost gets more and more human as the different stages of the haunting progresses, and then the very last scene in the park in Oxford is the ghost is almost a full representation of Lizzie, of his lost wife, and I think it's then it was the realization that again, it's not the haunting that was the key driver of this story. It was the person who was suffering the haunting and what it meant to them, and you know, again, whether the ghost is real or not is ambiguous all the way through and not fully answered, but it's what he needed to see at that point. And you could argue that it's he needed to see that, and so his mind let him see that, or you could argue he needed to see that, and so the ghost of his dead lover manifested in that way for him. So I think it was realizing that in some way this isn't actually a horror story in that sense of it's got a ghost, it's got the actual more horror scenes probably occur around the middle, I think, and the actual structure of it was quite different about how the scenes needed to happen and what they meant, and that was, you know, it's quite unlike most things I've written, really, in that it is a ghost story, it is a supernatural story, but in that sense about what I was trying to get to and the structure that then entailed, it was different. So I think it was just that realization about this isn't you know, an M.R. James ghost story, or it isn't a Ramsey Campbell style ghost story. This is something a bit different.
Yeah. So and you talk about M.R. James, Ramsey Campbell. You talk about other writers there. Would you say there was anything like any writers, any writing, or any films or anything that had a direct influence on this story for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, they're quite random, really. But I mean, so the title itself is taken from a Bob Dylan song, which is "Visions of Johanna," which is about. Well, I have no idea what it's about because it's Bob Dylan. But the first few lines are talking about tricks in the night, which has always made me feel of like a haunting and a ghost. And that led directly into that scene that I read out at the start. Actually, that idea that when you're just falling asleep and you might think that someone's touching your leg even though they're not there. So that idea of tricks being played in the night when you're trying to get off to sleep played into it quite a lot in that story. So I kind of see the sleep is the central character's almost lack of emotion in the face of his wife's death. So he's deliberately non-emotional and trying to be disengaged from it. And then the ghost is playing tricks, trying to wake him up into the actual emotions that he should be feeling. And then the other sort of thing that's deliberately referenced in the text that's similar is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which is a bit pretentious, but the first line of that is April is the cruelest month, and again that's about the idea that growth and rebirth is painful and hard and cruel, and again his rebirth is going from that sort of dead emotional state back into feeling the pain and loss of his wife's death, and that's the only way he can actually be reborn metaphorically back into feeling a full set of emotions, being human again. So yeah, there was a few sort of random things like that aren't horror stories or anything like that, but just sort of fed into those ideas and things to steal essentially and sort of weave into it.
You brought something up there, which was something I was kind of aware of, but I don't think I'd ever really had it verbalized in my head until you said it. But I knew that this is like a subversive kind of ghost story, sort of stating the fact that it's not traditional. And it's that lovely idea that you just kind of brought out there about that our main character, he starts off effectively dead emotionally.
Yeah, and I think that was the key to finding writing this story, that it's about him. The ghost isn't about death almost. The ghost is almost a symbol of life and him coming back to life, and that's sort of a version of what a ghost means in the story. That symbolism, doing it the other way.
Whilst we kind of talk about the themes in that, what themes then would you say that you are bringing out within trying to be so quiet and with the others in the collection as a whole?
So I think as a whole, it was the way I sort of grouped them in my head was it's the idea of the supernatural as not a metaphor for grief, but almost a sort of manifestation of grief. So people often talk about horror tropes and weird fiction about how things feel unreal and how it might make the world around you feel unreal or social relations feel unreal. But I think if you've ever experienced, real harrowing loss or real grief, it's almost the same. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel it's very hard to imagine it when you're not in the midst of it, and when you are in the midst of it, it's very hard to think that other things around you are actually important and real. So it's that idea that when people are grieving, when people are suffering loss, that there's almost an unreality to that, or it can make the world around them seem either unreal or without consequence that it had before. So that's how I sort of view the stories of being grouped together. It's the idea of grief being such a powerful force that's a way to kind of represent it, and that they're quite different stories, as you know. So obviously, Trying to Be So Quiet is a ghost story. Ironically, from what I just said before, I think The Monkey's Paw is a zombie story, and The Second Wish, which is based on the story in The Monkey's Paw. But that's a zombie story essentially, and though you never see the zombies in it. And then Damage is maybe it's a ghost story, I don't know, a ghostly story. But yeah, it's that idea of loss and how it might sort of manifest itself in a supernatural way is how I see them all hanging together. And calling it other hauntings, I guess that's what I see a haunting as that kind of supernatural manifestation of loss and grief.
One of the things I want to talk about kind of a bit sort of generically before we move into a few deeper bits is about your writing style in particular. And where would you say, how have you developed your writing style? Is there particular literary heroes that you think you've taken from or shaped what you do, or what? Where do you think you write? How do you think you write like you do?
I think there's so when I was growing up, my dad's got what's called the spare room in our house, which is essentially a room full of books, which he always encouraged me as a kid to sort of read some of them. So at quite an early age, I was reading some of his science fiction books, sort of old Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov and things. And then one day he took down a book and said, so I was about 15, and he said, or maybe 14, try this one, and it was Salem's Lot by Stephen King. And I can still remember the cover of it, and I can still remember I'd obviously read scary things before and seen Jaws and seen various other scary things, but I just remember that, whatever you think about Stephen King, when you've read more horror books, but just the idea that someone would write a book this long and this serious about horror, and the way that the town in it was so well depicted, and it was like a microcosm for various things. So I think, as cliched as it is to say, but I wouldn't be the writer I was if it wasn't for reading Stephen King. And as soon as I finished that book, I went on to read all the other Stephen King books my dad had on his shelves. And then I think probably the second biggest influence was Ramsey Campbell. Again, quite young, so we used to go every summer. Would have a trip to Cleethorpes, which is on the Lincolnshire coast, and we'd play on the beach and have fish and chips and go to the pub. But there was a good second-hand bookshop there, and I picked up this Ramsey Campbell collection, which is called Dark Feast, and I was reading it on the way back, and I think that struck me really, just the way that his use of language. I think maybe up until then, I was doing English classes at school, and you'd have to analyse poems or what have you, and I never really made a connection in my head between that kind of what I probably thought was fancy use of language and then the stuff I might be reading like Stephen King, and then reading someone like Ramsey Campbell as like the kind of understanding that both those things are actually connected, and that you could write. You can't separate a Ramsey Campbell story from the language that he uses. So I think those were the two real kind of formative reading experiences that were influences is almost to a light word. It was almost deeper than that. I think I was at that kind of age where I just internalized it so much that it wasn't a conscious influence. It was just taking those kind of things on board. And certainly, I wrote short stories probably from that point onwards, and it was a long time before I realised things like that maybe short stories weren't as commercial and things, because I just didn't understand that, because I didn't have any connection to the markets or anything like that. And I just thought, well, if you're a writer, you write short stories as well as novels. That's what you do. So I think I took a lot from that without even realising it, just about what I thought, how horror worked and what forms it worked in best and that kind of thing. So they're probably the two formative ones. Then later on, Shirley Jackson's been a big influence, Robert Aikman, and then various people as I've grown up, and you sort of even nowadays I might even meet some of the people who influenced me, which is a whole different ball game. But yeah, I mean they're the two real formative key ones that it feels like underpin almost everything I've written in some way, even if it's a complete reaction against how they would do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you have those inspirations early on, and then you say that the reaction. So sometimes it's this is how they done it. Let me see if I can do something completely the opposite. That's sort of how you approach stuff sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think one of the big books by Stephen King that influenced me was his non-fiction one, which is Dance Macabre, which is all about horror and horror fiction. I think again the idea that you could think about it as its own tradition, and then once you understand that tradition, you can find your own place in it and find the bits you can do differently. That was quite a big influence as well, I think.
Well, that's interesting. So going back to trying to be so quiet, how long did it actually take you in physical time from the initial idea to the final draft?
I think it was it was a few months. It wasn't too long. I was kind of mulling it over my head for a bit about how to approach a ghost story, and then I had the sort of idea, and then a lot of the early scenes came really quickly, and then, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I hit this kind of not knowing how to end it, and I had a few endings where, you know, the ghost would do something bad to the main character or send him out, you know, all these things, and that there was quite a few weeks cycling around those kind of ideas, and they were a bit shit, really.
So can you tell then some of those ideas might have been?
I mean, they were really kind of cliched ones, I guess. That the ghost actually wasn't his wife; it was some kind of evil thing that wanted to trick him, and then, you know, either sent him mad or made him kill someone, or, you know, just really almost B-movie kind of things.
Okay.
Onto the end, almost like I was almost trying to get a twist, and then I think there was a point where I realised it's actually not a twist; it's a continuation and a deepening of what you've written before, which is about the grief and is about the fact he's not coping with the fact he's lost his wife.
Which kind of almost is a twist, I think, when I kind of read it. The fact that it becomes that bit, and you're like, oh, there we are, sort of thing.
Yeah. There's the lack of a twist is a twist.
Yeah. Well, to me, it made it so much more powerful. I mean, you know, I've read the book. Well, I've read the book a number of times. I read it first because you wrote this book, and it was originally published under Boo Books, wasn't it?
That's it. Yeah. Which Alec Davis did. Yeah.
And then Boo Books folded, and then we picked it up. So I'd read it as in the Boo Books format first, and then of course I reread it again when it was when we were going to publish it. So, you know, I've read it probably about 3-4 times, I think, at least. And every time I get a damp tear at the end of that, God damn you, James! I shake my fist as I'm weeping through the pages. But it is that bit. It's so well done. But I digress. So sorry. Going back to it. So yes. So how long did you say it would take you roughly to write it?
Yeah, I mean, it's only a few months, I think, looking back. I mean, I'd say there was quite a bit of fiddling with the ending, but, you know, it is a relatively short piece. I think I really hate the word novelette, actually.
Yeah,
I'd rather just call it novellas, but, you know, I think technically it is a novelette, and so, you know, the first sort of 75% came quite easily, and then I was faffing around with the ending because I was writing ones that I thought were, you know, proper horror endings, in inverted commas, rather than an ending that was true to the story. But then at a certain point, it was just like it just came out, and then there was not much rewriting or redrafting. Actually, there was very little that I had to redo over. Once I think subconsciously I probably knew the ending. I just didn't trust myself. So yeah, 2 or 3 months probably from start to end, really.
Did you? So it's interesting that the ending. You know, you said you had to trust yourself with that. I always think that's a big thing. I think I read it in a Chuck Palahniuk book where he turned around and said, "You need to trust yourself as a writer." So, like, was it the ending came to you, or did you get any feedback from somebody prior to writing that ending?
Yeah, no, there was no beta readers or anything. I've used beta readers on occasion, but I think there's something about this that felt quite. It sounds odd to say personal because I've not, you know, I'm not a widower. I've not lost my wife, and I've not actually been in that situation in any way. But it felt like one I needed to trust my own instincts on to get the plot nailed down. Not, I think a beta reader might have said the same kind of things that I was trying to do about, well, it needs a horror ending, it needs a more kind of expected ending. So I think this was one where I just had to sweat it out on my own, as it were, and not defer to the crowd.
And how did you get? Because I've already said, you know, the ending made me cry multiple times, even when I know it's going to still get there. So it shows the power in the words themselves. So how? This may sound a bit of a tough question to ask sometimes when I ask people these kind of things, but how did you get that emotion into those pages?
That is tough. I think it was I think it maybe goes back to what I was trying to say before, that I let go of the idea around whether it was important, whether the ghost was real or not, and it's the idea that what the ghost means to him is real, regardless of whether it's in his head or in the world, and what that is his wife, is the real person. So I think it was, I don't know, I was trying to be quite lean in that last bit, and not have it too overwrought. And the ghost, his wife, doesn't say anything, is deliberately silent, and he doesn't actually say that much. And the setting, I guess, as well, was all part of it. The park and the going back to the idea of the wasteland, but there's new life coming up, and there's squirrels with nuts and things. I don't know. I think it's hard to say where emotion comes in writing from. I think you put the words in an order, and if you get it in the right order, it's like Tetris, and it all starts to glow and it all works. But if you put it in the wrong order, then you fucked it up. So I don't know. It's quite hard. I guess I guess you just have a bit of a spider sense that you've read stuff like that affects you before, and then if it makes your spider sense tingle when you're writing it, it's hopefully okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hitting on it there with the ending of that story. It's more about, there's a lot of what you don't say. You're not being explicit on certain things, so it builds that connection more within the reader. But I did wonder, was any of that a personal take? Like, I know you said you hadn't been in that situation, but had you been in that park? Had you had an emotional upset in that? Because I felt so real and so emotional. I can imagine you actually being in a park there and thinking about a lost love.
I mean, the park itself is based on a real one within Oxford, which is where I studied, like, the central character. So I think it mentions in there that. So I went to Oxford Brookes, which is the sort of ex-polytechnic there, which has a sort of odd relationship with Oxford itself, and it almost makes it feel. You can almost entertain the romance, I guess, if you like, of the setting more, because you're not actually living in it. You can wander around the buildings, and they're still quite remarkable to you. Whereas the people I met who actually studied at Oxford University itself, they were like, well, I live in there. That's where my toilet is. Like, it's got no romance for me. But yeah, it's quite a special place, and it was probably there's a deliberateness about so where the characters live in for the majority of the story is unnamed, and then he goes to a specific named place, which is supposed to tie into that idea about he's coming more back into life. So he's in this sort of unnamed place where he's just in his house and his work and things, and then he as he's emotionally awakening again, he goes back to a real place where he first fell in love, kind of thing. So I think it's just that is somewhere I know quite well, and it was just an obvious setting. It's not that I've experienced anything specifically like that there myself. It's one of those places where I've been around it so much that I've probably had really happy times there and really bad times, and the fact I know it so well has meant all the different emotional reactions have all merged together and cancelled each other out. It's not a place I've been once and had one reaction to. It's a place where I can almost imprint what I want on it. But yeah, I wanted it to be a specific location to kind of tie into that idea that he was coming more back into the real world.
Okay, yeah, and so in the place so well, you could put yourself in and then describe that area, which I guess sort of was getting from that. So you've mentioned Stephen King. You mentioned he was like an influence within on you. So you've I assume you've read his On Writing book.
Yes, a few times.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read much Stephen King myself. I've read the odd bits here and there, but I have read that On Writing book, and I really liked it. In fact, it made me want to go back and read more of his books, to be honest. But there's an interesting bit that kind of sort of stuck with me on that, which is like how he writes books and how he goes back to edit. And with himself, he's like he said something about, isn't it second draft is first draft minus 10% or something like that? It's all about taking stuff out. And I wondered with you, did you have that same similar process that once you've written the first draft and going into the second, you're moving stuff around and changing it, but are you taking stuff out or are you adding stuff in?
I think I'm on the opposite and add things in. So I'll if I'm kind of stuck on the first draft. So if I say if I know a character needs to make a certain decision, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to make them make that decision. If I get too bogged down in that, I'll literally put something in square brackets as a note and say character needs to do this here, and then just move on, and then hope that what I write about after that decision will allow me to figure it out.
That's interesting.
So no, my first drafts are almost more, if I have to leave gaps in, I need to know what the gaps represent and what should be in there, if you like. But no, that I try and do them fast and not get bogged down in those in the not get stuck and not not sort of spin the wheels, because I feel like I don't want to get stuck in the mud.
Yeah. So you're
I always need to get to the end. I mean, it's interesting. You say about I don't plan it out. I almost feel like the first draft is the plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just a very very big long plan that's taken a lot of effort paid to write. But yeah, no, almost the opposite of that. The first drafts are often just got gaps and things that need plugging.
Well, that's interesting. So yeah, so your idea is you want that structure down, you want that start and end in middle, and you know what's happening with all the plot points in there. So when you go back to type it in and you've got the square brackets, you find you build it up in layers, so it's multiple drafts to get to that point, or is it all kind of spill out in the second draft?
I think that varies between story to story often. I mean, it's nice on the odd occasion where I just go back to type it out and then it all sorts itself out and you're almost there by the work, going through the spellings and typos and things. But it's sometimes not that easy. I think for this particular story, it was quite easy actually. To say once I got the ending nailed, it almost all sort of flow together. I don't think there was that many gaps or inconsistencies. But there's, I quite often have quite random things in the first draft, where characters' names are changing, or I completely forget that someone has a sister, or all those kind of things. So there's quite, I quite often start, maybe I write about a sister and think it might be important, and then it doesn't crop up, so I just need to edit all that out because obviously it wasn't important. And it's part of working out. I think if I did a plan, I could write down, he's got a sister, and then I'd think, well, I need to put the sister in the different points in the plan. But where it just comes out, he hasn't got a sister. That's how I work those kind of things out. So that's why I don't think about planning as much as just having that skeleton in place and letting the first draft sort those kind of things out intuitively, I guess.
When you're writing, do you listen to music, or are you one of these people that like you need silence? Lots of people need different kind of environments. Some people music without lyrics, and or some with particular stuff they know really well. It's all different types of environments. So I wondered, what environment do you like to write in, and do you listen to music whilst you're doing it?
Yeah, I nearly always listen to music. I think that's when I was a student and I was trying to write, I guess, seriously for the first time, and I was in some halls of residence that had quite thin walls, and a girl who was on one side of me she had a really good taste in music actually, but she used to play her music really loud, so it wasn't the case that I had a choice of writing with music or without music. It was writing to the music she was playing through the wall or writing to my own music. So I've always, the work at university and the writing, I've always listened to music, and I'm not one of these people who's fussed about whether it's just, I know some people only listen to instrumental music when they're writing because they don't want the words, cropping up. But I just have on whatever I want and feel like, really. Actually, with this story, there was quite an odd, because I was writing about, in some scenes, him being a student back when I was a student, and so I had I was started to listen to a lot of the stuff I'd listened to when I was a student, or not even the things I maybe owned, but the stuff I heard in clubs when I was a student. So although it's quite a weird, sad, spooky story, but I was listening to a lot of Britpop and a lot of not even the big Britpop bands, not your Blur or whatever, but the weird people who had one Britpop single and were on the coattails of everyone else and had these like Menswear. Do you remember them? I mean, they were shit.
About to say like Menswear.
Yeah, and it was like I didn't even own it, but that was what I was thinking about, going out to those kind of clubs and those kind of tracks being played. So yeah, I was listening to some really kind of sort of chirpy, catchy, annoying songs when I was writing this quite somber, dark story. So quite a disconnect, really. So yeah, I don't have to have music that suits what I'm writing or fits the mood. I mean, often maybe the disconnect, maybe that works in my favor and just triggers odd things on my mind. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I just there's always music, but it's very rare that I don't sit down and think, oh, I need to listen to something a bit dark about someone whose wife's died to write this book about someone whose wife died. I've probably got let's say Menswear or Northern Uproar or random crap like that on in the background. So that's probably not the answer you're expecting, given the conversations we had about music. But that was true for this one, certainly.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. You're not the first person I've spoken to that actually listens to that listens to different stuff and it doesn't sort of affect their mood. Like they'll sometimes put happy stuff on. I'm curious, actually, when you're writing and you're in the zone, do you even hear the music that's on in the background?
So yeah, I mean, sometimes probably not. I think it's like that. When you're driving and you don't actually hear the music always, do you? You're in that zone. And sometimes, you really, if you're stuck, I'm a big fan of, there's this kind of Brian Eno card where you can, you just have a random kind of prompt and it can help you get around a creative problem. So, just listen to some random song and maybe the title or the odd lyric will trigger something. So yeah, I don't wallow in the kind of mood that I'm trying to create with the words. I think that would be counterproductive the way I kind of write. I think I just need the ideas bouncing around in my brain, and I'll get 9 shit ones and 1 good one, and then I'll progress. So I don't find any way I can force inspiration by just forcing a mood in the external environment, music included.
Yeah, and that's interesting. You talk about like the mood. You don't need to because you can. You're writing that anyway. In thinking about trying to be so quiet and it being that's it because it is a sad and somber story.
Mm-hmm.
When you were writing and you're writing this stuff, do you kind of feel that? I'm assuming you're feeling that kind of emotion as you're writing about it. So what happens when you stop writing? Are you still in that zone? Do you still feel like that? And does it take a while to change the mood, or do you just close the laptop or put the pen down and you're different James?
So I think getting to the end of the story and finishing it is different James. I think it's I think what I said about earlier, that when you are feeling those kind of feelings of loss and grief, it's very hard to imagine when you weren't, and when you're not feeling those kind of things, you can't really put yourself back in that place. And I'm not comparing writing the story to the actual experience of those things, but I think looking back, it's almost the same. That I can't. It's hard to actually remember what it was like being in the middle of it and trying to write about these kind of things, because it's an experience that's over. And in the same way that when you do get past as much as you can, death of a loved one, this is something that is over, and
it's hard for me to think back what it was like emotionally when I was writing it, because that emotion was there, but it's very hard to sort of recollect. I think I do have an ability to, once it's done, to as you say, sort of turn the page and say, right, well, that's done now. And you probably couldn't write fiction unless you did have that ability, because you'd never, if you suffer real grief from writing about fictional grief, you'll probably write yourself into an early grave, I think. But yeah, I think it's quite hard actually to look back and think what emotional state I was in. I think it's one of those stories where it is so much about the emotions and not about the plot and the mechanics and things, that it's almost like tricking yourself, being into that mindset, and then you trick yourself back out of it at the end, and it's quite hard to articulate where you were in the middle, because the way I articulated it was by writing the story.
You can be quite removed from it when you're walking away from it and stop writing it, which like you say, a book like this, that's good. It'd be quite morose in the Everington house when that was being written. Yeah. I'd imagine. So we've talked about the fact that you used Oxford as a location because it was a place that you knew, and I wondered if there was any other significance for any of the places or the characters' names in the book, or were they all just made up, or did you particularly choose names or places for particular reasons?
So I mean, the central character, I'm trying to work out if this got better, isn't named at all in it, and that was a deliberate choice on the same kind of thing, that he's almost not a real person at the start, because he is so kind of cut down by this grief. So I didn't want him to be like an everyman character, because it's quite a specific thing that's happened to him. But at the start, he hasn't got a name, and he's living in a place that isn't named. And the idea of Oxford was it was a specific place it was going to, which, as I said before, was the idea that he was coming sort of back into the real world. The other sort of theme about Oxford that's in the story is around the idea that a lot of the buildings and things in Oxford, and the whole idea of the universities, is this idea that they're things that actually outlast an individual. So I think when some of the history of some of the buildings in Oxford, the person who was the architect, because of how they had to build buildings in the late Middle Ages, they didn't actually live to see their designs built. It took so long to build these kind of things with these beautiful buildings that they were dead before they were finished. And the same with like cathedrals and that kind of thing. And that sort of linked in my head with the idea that the libraries and the accumulation of knowledge and the institutions there were the same kind of thing, that they were ideas that outlived people, the people who originated them, which seemed to fit into their sort of ghost story, that it's they're things that outlive the living. And in a more prosaic way, if you've ever wandered around Oxford, it's all these white buildings. They look quite like big gravestones. They look quite like bones. And there's also, it's a city of people walking around. There's less traffic there because it's also narrow streets in the middle. And I wanted quite a lot of scenes of just walking and people walking around. I didn't want him to be in a car and see a ghost. I wanted him to be away from people, and the idea that walking is walking around a city is a way of making sense of it. So there was a lot of reasons I picked it. I'm sure if my life had been different and I'd gone to different places, I would have picked somewhere else. But yeah, it was quite deliberately chosen. A lot of the stories I write don't have specific places referenced in them. They're kind of set in generic shopping centres, or motorway services, or industrial estates, or council estates or those kind of places where they're almost the same everywhere. But this is one of the few stories where it is a specific location for a specific reason within the story. And in terms of names, I don't think there was any. As I say, he's not got a name at all. I don't think there was any particular reason for any of the other names that I can think of in that story. I'm afraid.
Right, so I'm going to cast your mind back to the point when the story. So we're going to think about trying to be so quiet when it was first released. So that was with the Boo Books edition.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cast your mind back. It's been completed. It's there. It's all ready to go. It's been proofed. It's just about to be released. How are you feeling?
I think I was actually quite nervous in a way because, as I say, the idea that it was a ghost story, but it's not got this traditional structure of building towards a sort of crescendo of horror, or whatever you want to call it. It's actually quite a subdued ending, really. And the real sort of horrific scenes become horror scenes happen probably at the midpoint. So I think I was quite concerned, I guess, that people would be reading it and wanting it to be something that it wasn't trying to be, that they were wanting it to be an old-fashioned ghost story or a newer style horror story with some kind of grisly ending, probably like the ones that I junked. And then I think tied to that, the fact that it is only just over 10,000 words, and at that point when Boo Book's releasing it, it was a hardback edition. So for a story that size, it was it was a reasonable chunk of people's money. And then if they were disappointed because it wasn't what they're wanting, I think I was thinking this could all go horribly wrong, and people will really hate it. But fortunately, that wasn't the case at all, which was a nice surprise. Yeah, I think it's one of the few things I've been the most nervous about what people's reaction would be, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you doing something very different. It's all very well doing it inside your own head in your own home, but when you get other people to then look at it, you suddenly realise, don't you? I'm doing something a bit different here. Oh, but you say it came out and it got a reaction. So, what was the critical reaction to it, and more importantly, how did you take that?
I mean, I think when I've seen the comments and how people reacted to it, it's quite an emotion reaction. Which I guess is inevitable given the subject matter. But I think it was, I think it took me quite by surprise, the almost the strength of some people's reactions to it. That maybe wasn't, you live with writing it for ages, and then obviously you're correcting the proofs and things when it's coming out and things, and so you get a bit of an emotional distance to it. And I think the fact that people did react quite strongly to it, particularly that final scene that you sort of mentioned. And I guess I think one of the things I did try and think when I was writing it, that final scene, was letting it have a bit of space in for people to bring their own experiences to it, which are obviously probably not going to be the best experiences they've had in their life, and they may be reliving things that they weren't good at the time, or they may be anticipating those kind of things in the future. And I think I was quite surprised how much people did actually do that. I think it's got one of the most positive receptions, I think, of things that I've written, in that kind of there's a lot of people who've told me how much it sort of hit them, that ending, which is hugely gratifying, and the fact that it was, I don't think there's a single comment I've seen that said, "Oh, it's not a real horror story. It's not that scary at the end," kind of thing. I don't think anyone, well, if they have, they never told me. So I don't think anyone reacted like that. So I think the fact that everyone understood what I was trying to do and judged it against what I was trying to do, and not any expectations they had going in, that's hugely satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've kind of touched on and talked about already stuff that you were going to put in the book and taken out
Mm-hmm.
with regards to kind of the horror stuff. Was there anything else that we haven't talked about that you cut out of the book or was going to put in and didn't put out?
I think there was a few scenes where it was almost the ghost was, or the haunting was cruel or shocking for effect, rather than actually tying into the idea about it being this manifestation of grief and things.
When you say cruel or shocking, what was the scene?
The whole idea about the ghost is it's trying to lead him to that end point almost, where, you know, whether that's conscious on, you know, a ghost doing it consciously or his mind projecting it, but there were some almost quite cliched. The ghost appears and scares him, and he almost falls down the stairs, or, you know, those kind of things where it went back into the idea that the ghost could be a physical danger in some way, which isn't what the ghost was trying to be here. It isn't what the ghost is about, and you know, it's quite hard to let go of the idea that horror should have some sense that the main character might be under physical threat in some way. You know, even quite subtle horror stories or sort of ghost stories have that idea that the supernatural is a threat to the main character, you know, physically, in terms of killing them or harming them. And all that had to be jettisoned for this. So there was a few things like that where I was maybe writing on autopilot that I had to get rid of. But you know, nothing that was actually interesting or anything of any great importance, because that's, you know, I say that's not what this story is about. It's not about the physical threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say you are most proud of about this book?
I think sort of pulling off the idea that it was a ghost story where it's not so much about the ghost, it's about the haunted person, and about the idea that the climax of a ghost story isn't about an escalation of the horror to a point where it gets unbearable. The climax of this ghost story is about an acceptance and a healing of the main character, which I'm sure it's been done in places, but I'm not immediately sure where it's been done before. And it felt quite original when I had the idea and worked out the idea. And I think it's one of the stories where, you know, I'm one of those writers where I'm never happy with what I've written because it's never matched the idea that was in my head. But I think this is one of the ones that actually got the closest. So in that sense, I do view it as a success. And, you know, the fact that readers have reacted to it in an emotional way, which I'm sure they weren't faking, because it's very hard to fake that kind of thing. You know, that's the whole point of writing fiction, I think. So yeah, I think I'm just pleased it worked out, is what I'm trying to say.
And is there any details in the book that you say sort of sometimes overlooked?
I think I find it hard to answer. There's things I think are overlooked, but I don't know if I've just put them in there for me. There's a lot of stuff that is quite personal, and the little details around, as I say, the whole Oxford setting, and the references to songs that I like, which are associated with that time period in my head, and poems that I read. But I think probably it's one of those stories where there's space in there for people to bring their own emotions, their own experiences of loss in there. So although I think there's things that are maybe overlooked when people read it, I think it's not important, and they're probably bringing things to it that I would never have thought of, and will never know even in their own heads. So I think you know, grief and loss is one of those things that's so personal that it almost doesn't matter if it works for people. I don't care that they don't spot all the little things that I think are important in there. So there are almost things I don't want to articulate, because I don't want to make it about me and what I thought about writing it. I want to make it that people can bring their own ghost to it.
And that is a beautiful answer. Very much so. Well, James, I just want to say thank you ever so much for taking your time to take a trip down memory lane with me.
No, thank you.
Trying to be so quiet. Thank you very much.
No, yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Trying to Be So Quiet and Other Hauntings by James Everington is available on paperback and Kindle. The Kindle can be purchased from Amazon. The paperback can be found through most book retailers, including Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and directly via the Sinister Horror Company at the website sinisterhorrorcompany.com. Thank you for listening. Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.